Okay. Good evening, all of you. This mic, let me start, is not for loudspeaking. It's for recording. We are filming this event, and so everyone who talks has to talk into this, but you still have to talk very loudly so everybody can hear it. You are all very welcome to FUF and this meeting. I can assure you there were so many people who wanted to come, so we had to say no to some, and still then they don't come. So we are now contemplating to change our method of asking people who don't come, if they have promised to come, to pay. Yes. At least we are thinking of that. We don't know how to do it in practice, but
the credit card.
Credit card. This is part of a full series of meetings we have had this autumn on security issues. And we started out more theoretical. We had a large morning meeting a few weeks ago on food security and its relation with security in general. And today we have the pleasure to have with us Francesco Rampa, who is going to make a more in-depth discussion on food security issues. Francesco comes from from Milano and Maastricht. He works at ECDPM, and he will explain what that means. And we are very happy to see him here. He has been working with these issues very long, and he's very engaged. And I have heard him a number of times before, so I know that this is going to be very interesting. But he's going to present himself. He's also going to present ECDPM, and in particular, we will listen with very great interest to your presentation. And I hope that you will leave us some time for some questions also. So the floor is yours, Francesco.
Thank you very much, Lennart. It's really a pleasure. It's also a very nice setting, in a comfortable armchair. And yes, I had the ECDPM Food Security Program, and ECDPM is the European Center for Development Policy Management. If you go for the first slide, in fact, I have the outline of...
Is it back now?
The next,
Uh-huh.
yes. Because this is a bit the outline of what I'm going to talk about, and I think the Development Forum asked me to make a connection between policy frameworks and practice, and actually in terms of the connection between food security, conflict, with some element of also relation to climate change. And actually the European Center for Development Policy Management is all about trying to connect policy and practice. So that's it's an interesting way to start. We are a think and do tank. We think a lot, we try to think a lot. We write papers, and I have brought some publication in relation to these topics for those who are interested in going deeper. But the whole point is that we don't write anything, we don't think, if it's not in relation to what really happens on the ground. So to try to make the connection between theory and policy, but the real practice. And we are a small organization based in the Netherlands that has quite an immense network, especially in Africa, because we specialize in Europe and Africa relations. And we use expertise and knowledge, for example, from the scientific community, academia, the real experts in particular topics, and we use their expertise and messages to broker relations between Europe and Africa policymakers, and in particular the European Union framework and the African Union framework. So that will be the geographical focus of my intervention. And in my case, the food security program is tasked, and we receive demands from institutions like the African Union, NEPAD, the regional economic communities of Africa, to in particular work on the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program, which is the African Union big framework, political and policy framework to address food security in individual African countries, but also as as sub-regions of Africa. So I will start by explaining what is the official political accepted framework in every single African country to do action on food security, which is this CADEP, that has its problems but tend to be perceived as quite an effective tool and certainly owned by Africans. It's not an imposition from outside. And then I will explain how the European Union approaches its support to conflict and the relationship between conflict and food security, which they like to call resilience building. And then some, of course, of the problems to make the two fields and topics and the two policy frameworks better work with one another. With some also latest news on how that can be done in the particular case of the European Union. If that is clear, then I should speak around half an hour, I guess. If we go to the next slide, please. This is the picture summarizing what this comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program is. I know that I've read I Google Translate the outcome of your previous meeting on the relation between conflict and food security. So I know that you have covered some of the important theoretical linkages. But this, you see here the two official owners of the process, but you know the heads of state of the African Union, so really the head of state of all 53 at the time, now 54 African countries, have adopted a common approach to achieve food security and improve agricultural productivity and agricultural production. You don't have to go into the detail of this cycle, but the idea is that the CADEP has really managed to be a multi-stakeholder process, which maybe we can discuss whether in Europe there is enough participation of citizens in policy making, but certainly in Africa for many decades, especially agricultural policy was really closed space. There was no opportunity for farmers' organization or citizen to take part. Whereas the whole point of this cycle of activities that they call CADEP is get together everyone in a multi-stakeholder fashion to discuss what needs to happen in the coming, let's say, 5 years in terms of changing policies, legislation for agricultural growth and food security, but also investment. So the first part of the cycle is a big discussion that takes place in every country. So these common principles are adopted in every single country to adopt a regional, what is called a national CADEP compact. So a series of policies of decision of where the agricultural future of the country needs to go. But then this is discussed with everyone. It is based on evidence, so there's a lot of studies, a lot of assessment with external support, of course, but that African also scholars and stakeholders themselves undertake. And then once a decision is made on a set of policies and legislative change, that is written down in a compact. They call it a compact, a document. And they all sign that document. So this is also quite new for these processes, because this document is a consensus from the point of view of the government, the civil society, the farmers' organization, the umbrella organization of the private sector, as well as the donors. So every representatives of these constituencies sign this national CADEP compact. And I say regional also because this takes place in every single of the African countries, and I think now they're only missing some, of course, of the North African countries who have gone through a series of tensions, of course. But really 40 countries now have 45, maybe by now, have a national CADEP compact. And then also the regional economic communities of Africa, for what is relevant to be done through regional cooperation, they also adopt a regional CADEP compact, so a series of policies and legislative change in the different regions of Africa, so the eastern part, the western part, central and southern part. So there is also a regional CADEP compact that gets signed and discussed. Once the decision is made on what should be the direction and the policies, then all of the stakeholders together go to the next phase, which is designing the actual investment plan. So on the basis of where you want to go with your agriculture policy making, then you need to, of course, implement it, and a lot of that implementation is about not only making changes in legislation or policies, is actually putting money. So what is interesting is that, again, like in the case of the compact, the investment plan, the national investment plan, and then the regional investment plan also, are also a document where all of the participating stakeholders, government, donors, private sector, they actually sign an investment plan where they say where they're going to put their money. And the whole point and objective of the CADEP is that national governments, they should use at least 10% of the national budget devoted to agriculture to achieve, for example, 6% agricultural growth per annum. But what is interesting and relatively innovative is that also companies, donors, and also some foreign companies, they actually sign, as part of the National Investment Plan, documents where they say where they're going to allocate their resources. So this kind of public-private coordination and a commitment into one single document, that's pretty innovative. If you go to the next slide, I think that you can ask me, I can speak for a week about it, but I should try to summarize, because this is really where my team, for example, operates in Maastricht, especially in assisting the regional economic community to write their regional CADEP compact and investment plan together with a whole other series of stakeholders and partners. Of course, we cannot do it alone in Maastricht, but in the case, for example, of the Eastern African region, we actually work very closely with the Eastern African Farmers Federation and a number of donors and universities there to assist the COMESA Secretariat in preparing its regional CADEP compact and now investment plan. In fact, tomorrow I'm going to Lusaka, where one of these investment plans gets adopted, hopefully, in a multi-stakeholder fashion. So the point that I'm calling this CADEP as an example probably of development effectiveness is that it is certainly much more owned and discussed as a policy sphere and also as a decision on where to allocate the money, much more than other processes or parts of the Europe-Africa relation. I mean, you must have heard that for many years Europe and Africa were negotiating free trade agreements, so opening up the trade between the European Union and different blocks of African countries. And I worked on that for a number of years at ECDPM, and I got quite bored. But also I was always feeling that, and speaking to the African partners, that was an imposition from Europe, whereas this one is really a process where there's a lot of national-owned decisions. In the case of trade agreements, all of the studies done, for example, on what was the likely impact, etc., was done by external people. This is really a lot about also using African expertise on what needs to change in the agricultural sector. So in general, it's a much more owned process. It gives a whole basis for, which wasn't the case before, of mutual accountability. So the government is actually saying very clearly what it wants to do in the coming years on agriculture. The donors will have to do the same. In certain countries, even the private sector states where it's going to put its own investment in agriculture. So this is pretty interesting transparency improvement. And also it gives a predictability of ODA. It's been quite an advanced stage of making sure that all of the donors align to the same program. There are still problems, but in many countries, really, not a single donor is supporting agriculture and food security outside of that framework. So it has really enhanced in many countries donor coordination. You must have heard donor coordination for a number of years, and often it doesn't happen. In this case, at least in the agricultural sector, is quite advanced. Of course, there are still weaknesses, and if you are interested, we can go more into that, in the sense, for example, probably the most important weakness is that this has managed, as I said, to really drive and guide donor assistance in much better coordinated fashion. It has pushed quite a number of countries in spending more of the national public money into agriculture, but has not really managed to make more coordination and transparency on the private sector side. So in terms of actually stimulating a coordinated private sector investment, that's still quite a bit lacking. Another interesting weakness of that is that the CADEP has always acknowledged in general that food security is very important for conflict resolution and stability, but as we are speaking today, but it has not managed to do that. So the connection between food security and agricultural planning and stabilization in African countries, that has been missed and is also the fault to some extent of the CADEP. Now the next slide is just to show that this is particularly close to my heart, but because that's where we work at the regional level. What is important to say is that food security, as I'm sure you have discussed before, cannot be achieved in isolation. It's not food sovereignty. Now, maybe we can discuss the value of food sovereignty, but in many African countries, there is simply either they are too small or there are no agroecological conditions. Producing everything to feed the population is nearly possible. Yeah, maybe the European Union has worked on that, or big countries can try to do that, but a lot of the weak states and geographical conditions in Africa don't allow that. So a lot needs to really be done as a region in terms of doing much more amongst neighbors in Africa to make sure food security is achieved. And there is an immense potential to do that. If you just think at the two most food insecure region in Africa, the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, for example, it is obvious that including because of drought, but also the natural tendency, for example, of pastoralism to be very mobile, and this is very important in these areas. I mean, the food in the form of cattle, etc., moves according to certain dynamics related to tribes, etc. So de facto there is a movement of a lot of food. The opportunity to trade amongst the African countries is immense, but is not exploited because there are political motivations, but also there are still very strong trade barriers in Africa. So even if it makes a lot of sense for a farmer, as we will see in certain countries, to just use informal trade and small rural roads to just go and sell across the border, this is often not possible because they are blocked by very thick, they are called thick borders with customs official who often even require bribes to get goods across, etc., etc. So there's a whole series of improvements that can take place in food security in Africa by opening up amongst neighbors the trade of food. Of course, from the side of food security processes, there is also there are a number of issues that block this potential for much stronger regional cooperation in Africa for food security, and one we call horizontal coherence, in the sense that cooperation for food security is not only about trade, which I've just explained, but is also about transboundary water management. We have also a paper there looking into the connection between transboundary water management, if you think of the big lakes or the big rivers, and how important it is the use of water for agricultural growth. But so all of this would require different sectoral processes to come together and be coordinated, which often it doesn't happen, even if the ambition of these regional economic communities in Africa is to do so. So across sectors horizontally there are still solid problems, and they are treated in silos: is water from agriculture, from climate, and as we will see, of course, also in terms of conflict resolution. But there is also a lot of problem of vertical coherence. Everything is beautiful in the CADEP papers in principle at the African Union level, but then getting the real operational improvements down to the regional level, and even more so at the national level, is very difficult. And also there is a lot of incoherence what one country does. Banning food, for example, that's a typical, even if they have a lot of maize and they could export it in the neighbor countries, they still say, no, we have to keep our maize in here in Tanzania, whatever, in Kenya, just in case. And this is actually creating a lot of suffering in neighboring countries. So the vertical coherence is another very important missing link. it's important to note that in principle regional cooperation is also very important for resilience and conflict resolution, and in particular in these two regions of focus, West Africa and East Africa, we have cases of approaches to conflict resolution and the connection between food, on paper I'm talking about, between food and crisis prevention that happen as regional. So there is a whole series of institutions, processes that look at this connection, and one is the RPCA in the case of West Africa, and the other one is in the case of the IGAD region in the Horn of Africa. Now, the next slide just visualizes some of the potential for this regional cooperation that I was mentioning. If you look at, for example, you have experts much more than me, like IFPRI, International Food Policy Research Institute, who make the calculation. And for example, you could say that if West Africa could actually improve its yields, it would turn a dollar trade deficit, because all of these African regions, exactly for these problems, if agriculture production and food security end up importing most of their food. But if they could turn amongst each other more open trade, they could turn what today is a $2 billion input deficit into a surplus. If they could make better connection across their shared waters, they could open up their field and agricultural improvements, they could actually grow so much productivity they could actually become big exporters of agriculture up to these mega amounts. And then the next slide just explains what I was mentioning in terms of course, these countries, if you take Eastern and Southern Africa, are very large. And the problem of the thick barriers is that, just take the red spots are the major urban centers where there is an immense growth of population and middle class, and there would be a lot of willingness to buy much more produce of smallholder farmers. And if you take the top dot, the red dot, that's Nairobi. For the eastern, for the Tanzanian stakeholders, which is the country to the south, all of northern Tanzania could massively serve the Nairobi mega market for billions and billions of dollars, but simply that border is thick. So in the end, Kenya has to import a lot of food through, for example, the Mombasa port, instead of just, which takes money and additional costs, etc. And in the end, these farmers, instead of exporting their food close by markets in Nairobi, they have to, if they want to get more money and better prices, they have to take the food down to, for example, Dar es Salaam, the Tanzanian capital, which is further away, and often they cannot do that. So that is also replicating patterns of poverty. The next slide. I'm not a climate change expert, but of course climate change is so important, and there is a whole discussion. You can ask me a question about what today is called climate smart agriculture, or a number of definitions about how to try to make agriculture more or less impactful on climate. Roughly speaking, at the global level, climate agriculture is responsible for a quarter of the global world greenhouse gases emissions. So in particular in Africa, given that it's the most food insecure region, but also the fact that Africa has, roughly speaking, 60% of uncultivated arable land in the world, so it has a big potential to do much more on agriculture, including to feed the rest of the world. The way you connect climate change and agriculture is very important. And of course, the most serious the climate change problem becomes with the whole series of dramatic climate events, further and more serious droughts, water scarcity, that are already impacting Africa. Making this connection is very important. So I just wanted to make sure that we have in mind that on top of all of the existing problems for food security, climate change is making this worse. And as you probably have discussed before, that the major obvious channel that transmit the problems of climate change impacting on food security is the prices of food, because climate change makes often in Africa, indeed this is already happening in particular countries, simply more difficult to produce food, so the prices increase, plus the scarcity of food and competition for resources like land and water increases, ethnic tensions or predatory behavior by the elites. So all of this also has an impact on the instability of countries and the actual accessibility of food. This is a very broad picture, of course we can discuss, and the local context in the end is what really matters. And for example, price increase, which is the overall long trend that is also predicted to get worse and worse through climate change, and these are the international panel on climate change predictions, is that there is no doubt that unfortunately food prices are going to increase in the world because of these climate change conditions. But for certain countries, if you're Brazil, that's not bad, because you're going to get more food, and Brazil is a mega exporter already of major commodities like soya, etc., etc. If you are Thailand or Vietnam, that's very good that rice prices are going up. But a lot of the African countries, the fact that price of rice is going up is really dramatic, because more and more urban consumers in African countries want to eat rice, and the price is going up, and they're coming from Asia. That's quite dramatic, and that has also led to riots, as we've probably discussed before, in certain countries. So whether you are an importer of food or an exporter of food makes the whole connection between climate change and food security very different. The other obvious connection between climate change, food insecurity and political instability is natural resources. The higher the rewards for capturing what they call the rent-seeking benefits from managing natural resources, think of diamond, trade, etc., etc., and other minerals, the more you can access and handle natural resources, the higher the reward, the likelihood of conflict increase, and this is going to have very bad impact on the rest of the economy, which also further strengthened food insecurity. Some experts are also making the connection using the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change predictions, to show that just 1% of temperature increase globally by 2030 could actually increase of 54% the armed conflict incidents all over the world, and in particular in Southeast Asia, the Middle East and Africa. And you know that we can discuss, if you want, what's happening this week and last week in Paris, but countries, even if they're doing more than in the past, they are not going to manage to, at least that's what the UN says, they not manage to keep the increase in temperature compared to pre-industrial situation below 2%. This is going to increase. So just 1% temperature increase in the next 15 years is going to increase conflict massively. And then imagine if the increase in temperature is going to be 2.3 or 3% in the current scenario. So that's going to be a big issue. Now I leave for a second climate change as a topic, but of course you should ask a question, and I also have our latest publication on the issue of climate smart agriculture if you are interested. The next slide, I am starting to cover how the European Union and then in its relationship with Africa is dealing with peace and security processes. And in this sense, we have a team also at ECDPM that is working more on this, and that's the acronym of the team. The European Union has two major policy frameworks to do that. One is the comprehensive approach to conflict resolution, and this is managed jointly by the European Union Commission and the European External Action Service, which was the diplomatic service of Europe. And it's only, despite Europe is the largest donor in the world, and of course has been the colonial master of most African countries. This is only really recently that the European Union countries have managed to come at least to a minimum understanding of what can they do together to improve conflict resolution. We can discuss, this is not happening yet, but at least on paper there is a lot of improvement recently in recognizing what can be done together, and this is under what is called and what is labeled the comprehensive approach that was announced through European Union and its External Action Service communication at the end of 2013, and then adopted by the Council of Ministers, and then eventually early this year turned into a bit more of an action plan. Now, what is good about the fact that the European Union has put through a communication and the Council conclusions a joint approach to solving conflicts in crisis areas, and in particular in Africa, is that at least now there is a common vision by the ministers and a joint objective and some minimum joint approach between individual member states of Europe and the European institutions, who now share at least the analytical tools. So both European Union institution delegations, like the European Union embassies in African countries, as well as other institutions like the European Investment Bank, etc., they at least share with individual member states of Africa their resources in terms of what do we know about the country, what do we know about the causes of conflict. So at least there are official coordination platforms between member states and the European institution to do so. If you think of major players at the global level like France or England, and in particular for West Africa, for example, France, this is quite an important step, at least of sharing information. Up to a few years ago, France wasn't even asking the other member states of Europe. You still see that France goes ahead when it comes to conflict resolution in countries like Mali, for example, but at least in terms of the minimum analysis from secret services information and etc. on the ground, that's a bit more effort to at least share information. Of course, the cons in all of this is that a common vision and better information sharing has not translated into legally binding instruments to do these things together. So there is no clarity from these high-level frameworks and documents on where exactly such cooperation should be strengthened, what should be the financing mechanisms to do that, and also the task division is not very clear between, in operational cases like the conflict resolution in Mali, etc., or the Central African Republic or Somalia, is not very clear who should be doing what. There has been improvements in principle in the fact that now you have one, at least, person representing the whole European Union for foreign affairs issues and also the common security policy, who is the High Representative, who happens to be an Italian person now, Ms. Mogherini. But in terms of using the money, which is still a lot of money at the European Union level, for wise action on the country level, this has not improved much. So good principles, good joint objectives, better information sharing, but not real change on the ground. This is a bit better in the case of the other, if you go to the next slide, in the resilience framework. I should also a bit accelerate, so don't pay attention to these details, but this is important example I have here is to say that, for example, the member states remain very different in the way they approach security problems and defense. France, for example, doesn't really care about the soft aspects of dialoguing at the country level, asking his own development institution like the French Development Agency what should be the objectives. They just go straight for the hard interventions, totally on the other spectrum. So there is anything that you can expect in the examples of doing more or less coordination between development agencies and defense agency, and normally for what my colleagues who are more the expert and tend to compare all of the European Union member states in their approaches, is that, for example, the Dutch government is doing very well, and they really have what is called a 3D approach, development, defense, and diplomacy, where they really sit down in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Defense, etc., in what needs to be done in different aspects, and try to really use economic improvements in the country and the way the Dutch government helps African countries doing that in relation to how the Dutch government spends money. But as I was saying in the next slide, the resilience approach is improving. No, I would go to the next slide, please. So, of course, resilience is the ability of individuals and community and country and intergovernmental organization to better adapt and respond to external shock. So, of course, you could say resilience is an overall umbrella that encompasses different sectors of intervention, agriculture, conflict, etc. So the other very important policy framework that we have to take into account and discuss in the relationship between food security and conflict is this resilience approach. And unlike the case of conflict resolution and management, in this case the European Union has also only very recently decided on a common approach, but at least they have moved beyond just nice words and principles. So the communication at the end of 2012 and then the decision of politicians in the conclusion and the action plan have actually moved beyond just common vision. And again, some of what is nice is the principle. So only 2012 is the first time where the European Union accepted, all of the member states of the European Union accepted one, for example, definition of what resilience is, because you can ask different people and they have different opinions on what exactly resilience is. So one definition, the characteristics of what the European Union should be doing to support resilience in developing countries, especially Africa, that should be based very much on the country level processes, that you should coordinate humanitarian action, long-term development action, etc. But as we see in the next slide, this has moved beyond just good words and actually has put in place very formal processes to support resilience in Africa, not only by doing joint studies but also clarifying what should be the steps in spending the money. And it has actually obliged member states to coordinate with the other member states. So unlike the case of the comprehensive approach, this has actually led to a change in the way the European Union and member states coordinate themselves with some real initiatives, in particular frameworks, launched really jointly by all member states and institutions. Of course, this is pretty much still, we can discuss later, but this is still a donor view. So it's more concrete, the resilience approach of the European Union, than the comprehensive approach to conflict resolution, but it's still very much from the perspective of the donor. So when I say that there is better coordination, it's better coordination about the way the European Union spends money. But it's still very much of a donor framework, and it doesn't take into account what should be the dynamics in country at the endogenous level, what is the force of the civil society, of politicians, of members of parliaments in each country to resolve problems of resilience. So there is improvements in the way we spend the money in Europe for resilience, but we don't involve really yet the local actors. So this is just to say that even if it's better, this resilience approach, there are still a lot of bottlenecks. The next slide, please, is just to say that, concretely speaking, these are the two regions where the comprehensive approach, as I said, operationally has taken a better shape. So now since 2011 in the two most important and food insecure country, this has actually a binding framework for all of the member states and the institutions of Europe in the Horn of Africa and in the Sahel to act together. In the case of spending money, this has been improved, and now all of the institutions and member states of Europe align and use joint pool of money in the way they support the resilience in these two regions. But still on the ground, when it comes to individual projects, of course there are still weaknesses, because it also depends whether the implementing body of all of these resources from Europe is Europe Aid or DEVCO, or is ECHO, which is more about emergency situations. So the whole point of resilience and these two strategies was that both the emergency aid of European Union, which is handled by ECHO, and the long-term structural solutions supported by the European Union, which is handled by Europe Aid or DEVCO, they should work along in a more coordinated fashion, but this unfortunately hasn't happened everywhere because of the different perspective and mandates of these two major institutions, who ultimately are the program manager and the project manager of a lot of these resources. The next slide shows that certainly in terms of mobilizing resources, that has worked well, and we're talking about billions to support resilience in these particular two strategies to support the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, which are called in acronym SHARE and AGIR. And the next slide, basically I'm starting to discuss what are the, given this is the institutional frameworks and the big policy frameworks, we have seen the CADEP comprehensive approach and resilience approach. What can be done to connect the two? Because food security, the European Union acts well together. They all align to CADEP. They all follow the political decisions of the European Union, and this is happening. Defense, not really. Resilience, yes. But amongst the three, there is not really yet a coordination. And there are a set of people and projects about food security and agriculture, European member states who want to put more resources in there, and then there are other people who program in Brussels the resilience money, for example, and processes, and they don't necessarily yet talk to one another. But of course there are an important series of opportunities to do that in much more convinced and effective way. First of all, at least the rhetoric, and there is no more doubt about the importance of that, and especially now with the rhetoric and also media attention to climate change, has led these all strategies to also stress, at least in principle, that of course also climate change adaptation should be very important for conflict prevention through this food security channel. So at least theoretically, in terms of vision, the language and the rhetoric is there, and political statements by the ministers are all there, so we should exploit in the future this opportunity that at least has been now stated in writing in different frameworks of the European Union and member states, that this is that this needs to be done. You have also as an opportunity clearly improvements, at least on the side of agricultural frameworks from the African stakeholders and institutions. So the CADEP is a very important opportunity today to make that connection. At least now it's more clear and transparent what individual governments in Africa want to do for food security. So there are existing processing, meetings, reviews, certainly at the food security level, to try and make a better connection on what are the real changing condition of conflict or climate change problems. An opportunity is also that the research community and maybe institutions also like ECDPM are contributing to that, is that what you see there as PA is much more recognition that political economy analysis is very important as a basis to make decisions at every level, So in many donor agencies, there is quite a series of attempts to do political economy analysis of what is the problem in every country, who are the strong economic interests, what are the elites trying to do, who are the companies who really make a strong influence on their governments. So once you have clarity on that, you can base and have a better idea what needs to be done in the different sectors of intervention, being food security, climate, or peace and security. Another important opportunity is all of this has been very clear and clarified and more transparent in terms of African own new actors. There are a whole series of processes, I cannot list them now, and institutions, including think tanks, who are now, not many, but emerging in Africa as their own actors of change in Africa. The next slide, however, yeah, I'm sorry, I have to, for the sake of time, split that, but it was just a summary of the evidence, but you might have covered these issues in your previous discussion about what is the evidence, because I treat this as also as an opportunity. Compared to 10 years ago or 20 years ago, there's much more research, at least done outside of Africa and starting in cooperation with Africa to show what are the linkages in individual countries between all of these problems. And that in itself is a very positive step, because we are not just basing intervention on ideology, and as I said, important steps like the political economy analysis or statistical relation in individual countries between declining natural resources and food insecurity and then conflict. All of this is starting to become clear, not in general descriptions, but in actual numbers and statistics. So to me, the availability of evidence is also in itself an opportunity to be exploited. But the next slide, of course, unfortunately, well, money is of course a big other opportunity, so I'm not going to go through it, but this, you see the numbers. This is the just ended period of European Union money and planning in the cycle 2007-2013 for these issues, emergency aid and food security aid, and these are the new agreed amounts in the next cycle of European Union aid, and you see the numbers. We're talking hundreds of millions, if not billions, for individual parts of Africa or individual processes like I've just described. For emergency or for food security in different parts of Africa, we are talking about billions. So money is not the problem. Money, there's plenty of money, especially at the European Union in Brussels. So money is an opportunity, because you can blah blah about the importance of food security, but you don't have the real resources to support. So you can see money as an opportunity as well, and that is not the issue. Brussels has a lot of money, but then of course there remain serious problems. So in the next slide, I have started to list. Well, unfortunately, also I don't have a lot of time, but I have a paper that shows that some of this money is also being channeled now in a much more cooperative fashion. So this is just the last year that has happened. So as I said, the comprehensive approach, the resilience approach is now being taking in the last year an actual manifestation in terms of trust funds. So quite quickly, because of the migratory pressure, etc., the European Union member states have agreed to set up specific EU trust fund, which are a new channel and a new instrument of European external action. And these are the first three. One just adopted the Emergency Trust Fund that will be used to channel the money I showed, the funds I've showed in the previous slide. So at least this is a big opportunity for much better coordinated action, because these are now individual instruments, and member states will contribute directly instead of going into Africa with individual bilateral programs. So the EU trust funds are an important opportunity. They are new. We can't say much about their implementation yet, but I have a paper here that explains what they are and what the opportunities are. But of course I have to conclude my talk by saying that there are, with the next slide, that there are immense challenges, of course, in making this connection. First of all, the complexity in itself. because European Union and institution, European Union member states and institutions have made in a way their homework to have a common vision, to sit together in coordination processes. We now start seeing the emergence of aid mechanisms specifically addressing the connection between food security, resilience and conflicts, like the Trust Fund. But then the capacity to use the money wisely, it also really depends on the receiving end. So absorption capacity, the capacity of African institutions to handle this institution properly remains a big question mark. Despite all of the improvements at the institution and coordination level, a big second challenge remains the ambiguous role of donors. If you look at the fact that this is only in terms of consistently using amount of resources to make the connection between food security and resilience, for example, in the two areas of the Sahel and the Horn, is not only because these are the most food insecure area, because these are also the areas where the migrants come from in the latest flow, big dynamics in migratory flows, but it's also the areas where terrorists unfortunately are originating. If you think of Shabab in Somalia, or Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb and Boko Haram, etc. in the Sahel. So these are also the very strongly politically oriented decision by European Union member states to act and put their own resources in other areas where there is not such an immediate pressure on politically sensitive areas like migration or terrorism. This is not happening. So parts of Central Africa, if you think of DRC, Congo, all of the problems there, the still instability, which is really fueled by problems like diamonds and food insecurity there, all of this coordination, all of this money is not available, unfortunately. So we can always discuss that the political economy of donor decisions themselves remain a big issue, and there is a big risk that, for example, these amounts I have shown to you, this new trust fund, will only be rushed into to try and show to the public opinions in Europe that now their politicians are doing something. But the risk with also these EU trust funds is that you are now risking to precipitate a lot of money into Africa without, for example, considering what the CADEP wants to do. So what is the relationship between European Union Trust Fund to address resilience and the root causes of migration, which is the fashionable word everyone uses in Brussels, may risk to be decided upon very quickly without going back to see what in the last 10 years those individual countries and those individual regions were trying to do, as I said, through quite a transparent and lengthy process, which was the CADEP, to try and get everyone on board. So, of course, all of the broad problems that you probably know very well of development policy management are still there. Weak institutions, geopolitics, driving the decision of donors, the lack of capacity of African institutions to implement coordination problems, the coherence between all of these thematic areas. This remains quite difficult on the operational ground. I'm sorry I've taken a bit too long, but this is a bit the picture that is currently emerging.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you have given us a very comprehensive picture and a lot of points, and I'm sure that there are some questions and comments.
Maybe the next slide, if you show it, is my email. The next one, my email address and the website. So if you want to download the documents, if you want to ask questions, it's also possible.
Okay, and before you leave, please, if you are interested, pick up some of the documents. Now, the floor is open. Questions, comments? And you have to speak into this.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very comprehensive presentation with I understand a lot of different stakeholders and different aspects that need to be taken into consideration. I have basically two questions. One concerns, or is rather a question to you, where do you see the, let's say, the major three constraints in improving food security in Africa? Food security probably in terms of increasing productivity and increasing production of food. Where are the three major sort of constraints, addressable constraints? The other question is about aid. I was quite worried to hear that money is not the problem. So where is the problem? And to what extent could aid be, rather than assisting in processing, stopping them or preventing sort of developments in agriculture or food production? Thank you.
Okay, those two questions covers a lot. Perhaps we can add at least one or two more. Or should we? Yeah.
Hi. I have a question concerning the resilience approach, because you mentioned that it doesn't really cohort with other projects or works that it's been doing, and also the way the definition that has been chosen for resilience, and the way you said it was much of a top-down approach and more about efficiency and things like that. But I think a lot of it contradicts the meaning of resilience or how it's supposed to be used, and why hasn't that really facilitated the work, or what do you think about that? Because it's a very like a modern word that should be useful, but maybe not.
Okay, one more. No? Okay, let's start here then. We can come back to one more.
Yeah.
More time.
Well, to be honest, starting from this last one, it is important that we discuss resilience, and it is very relevant in the sense of what the European Union is doing, because the European Union has chosen to this word, as you say, as a fashionable word, but like in all development, unfortunately, cooperation dynamics, it really goes in fashions. So to be honest, on a personal level, and for what I observe in working with African institutions, etc., the African institutions and citizens and private sector, they don't really care what word you use to define all of this. The farmers are de facto resilient entrepreneurs, otherwise they would die. They know exactly that they have to react to climatic conditions. They know that exactly that if you have a high price, you sell. If you don't have a high price, you store your goods for when the prices are high. So resilience is a bit of, unfortunately, of an external definition, and the African institutions and governments have chosen to deal with improving food security rather than resilience. So it's really a bit of a pity that the Europeans have put so much emphasis in terms of aid instruments on the resilience side, and this creates continuous tension. The two particular resilience regional frameworks I've shown to you, Agir and in the Sahel and Share in the Horn of Africa, are actually donor-dominated programs that not necessarily match with what the two regions had decided previously to do under the CADEP regional framework, for example. So that remains a big problem of changing labels and donor fashions, and to me, I would actually prefer, and the Africans would probably prefer, that you would call all of this food security and maybe climate resilience in this particular case of emerging more lately problems in relation to the worsening climate conditions, rather than this general, very vague term resilience in general. But you have to live with it, because there are big amounts of money that are handled in Europe and in Brussels in particular that are coming under the resilience framework. So unfortunately, we have to try, and that's what my organization tries to do, is to make a connection and to explain also to the African institution what is this resilience policy making from the perspective of Europe, and to try and make the connection between food security and resilience policy making and processes better. So I have described it, but I myself think is a big issue that the Europeans have decided to call it resilience instead of just food security, for example. Aid is not a problem. I mean, the amount, the levels, that's what I meant, in the sense that actually, for example, the regional institutions I deal with, COMESA, the West African Community, ECOWAS, etc., they actually sometimes don't even spend the available resources they have. I think in certain of the regions, after 5 years, they access the resources, they sign an agreement with the European Union in SADC, the Southern Africa region, or ECOWAS, that they have such and such amount of millions to be spent on food security or resilience for the next 5 years, and then they arrive at the end of these 5-year cycles and they've spent not even half of it. For a number of reasons, because there are new institutions, they don't have the trust of their own political masters who are the individual African countries. So money is not a problem, and the problem, I would say, I would maybe summarize it in a word by using the word governance. The problems are all related ultimately to the way, I mean, let's say part of it is also due to our own self-interest in Europe and the geopolitics remaining, unfortunately, a key driver of how the decisions also on aid are made. So I'm saying in Europe we have still strong fault on how we don't manage to put all of these resources that are very high in levels into effective spending. And that's our fault, because we want to maintain political influence, or because we want to help our own companies, etc., etc. But I would say that even more important is the governance problem of African institutions. And until the African citizens don't manage to arrive at better governance conditions in their own countries, or in the way they talk and organize and manage their natural resources, their economies better with their neighbors, there's very little we can do from here. So to me, the major problem of spending aid resources remains the problem of governance in Africa, because elites still have in many countries a very intransparent way of managing aid, or they put the nice words in the frameworks like CADEP, etc., in order to access aid, but then even if on paper and in certain countries also, concretely speaking, this has improved through the CADEP, like in countries like Rwanda or Ghana or Kenya. In many other countries, they use simply frameworks like CADEP to access resources, and then they use it for their own benefit, or for the benefit of their own close friends. So maybe in the CADEP compact they have written that you should develop better the rice production in the country, because that would solve large import bills. And then the reality is that they don't use that money they receive from the European Union to actually strengthen rice. They use it for organizing meetings, pretending that they're going to improve the productivity of rice in their own countries, and then they let rice come from Asia simply because their importers, the large companies who make this import happen in the country, they have a very vested interest and gain a lot of money by remaining and continue signing the import contracts with big Asian producers of rice, etc., etc. So all of this can be summarized maybe in the problem of governance and elites' capture of whatever resources are there, including, unfortunately, aid resources. And then the first question regarding more the problems related concretely to productivity and why Africa remains the region in the world where the gap in productivity between what is today's actual productivity per hectare of land and the actual potential theoretical maximum production and productivity. Unfortunately, climate, it's difficult to say in rankings, but climate remains a big issue. There are certain regions where simply there is no water, like in these arid lands in the Sahel and in the Horn. And making changes in the irrigation systems, for example, is something that we have addressed in Europe ourselves through centuries without having the same problems of arid condition, lack of rain, or lack of water courses. So one big issue remains climatic conditions that are now exacerbated by climate change. Maybe the second I can mention is, which is related to the issue of governance I've just mentioned, is the economic rent-seeking problem. So in the sense that there are only few specific companies and few people in these African countries who are benefiting a lot of the way that agriculture production is organized. There are billionaires in Africa who have made a lot of money by doing plantations and turning all of the land in their countries into plantation of commodities that you sell in the international markets, but that people cannot eat. Coffee, cocoa, vanilla, banana, etc., etc. I mean, we eat it and we are happy that they are cheap, but I love coffee myself, I'm Italian, but the truth is that until Kenya, Burundi, Rwanda, these are economies that are based on one or two only crops. Until those lands are converted into producing more food, there's very little that can be changed. So there is still a problem of the way you organize and you structure your agriculture, and this simply doesn't change because of the governance problems, because of the elite captures, and the companies who are benefiting there are simply more influential than the smallholder, the majority of the smallholder farmers, who can unfortunately only produce for local consumption instead of slowly becoming better entrepreneurs so that they can actually improve the productivity. But to improve the productivity, you need to have the ability to sell. And the ability to sell is not there because you are not given access to land, so you cannot expand your plots because you had the expansion of land is only permitted to those who are friends of the politicians. So there are a whole series of problems that make agriculture policy making disadvantageous for the smallholders, because the smallholders don't have a strong influence on the politicians and are only marginal in the decisions that are made. To productivity enhancement is very much blocked by the economic structures today, and that to me is the other major thing apart from the physical problem of productivity of many soils and of many climate dependent agricultural systems.
Were you satisfied?
But maybe some of you have actually other points and suggestions. Maybe I'm forgetting elements here, so if you have another...
The question that one raises is, why would Africa be so different from other places? I mean, you have in Latin America the old systems of also ownership and governance issues and so on. Why should that, and also in Asia, I mean, why should it strike more in Africa than in other parts of the world? But that perhaps would take us too far.
Well, often climatic condition has made the difference. Maybe you can discuss whether there is an imposition of the colonial times and the fact that it's taking longer for basic infrastructure and economic systems to develop. But even if you had better politicians, wiser policy making, there are certain parts of Africa where there is no water, which is not the case in most parts, for example, of Latin America or Asia. At least there you have water, and that has, through the centuries, led to simply more available. If you think of rice, people eat, at least in Asia, even in extreme poverty, they eat rice because is water. In the Sahel, there is no water. You can't produce rice, basically, unless you change the whole irrigation system, etc. So a lot, to me, has still to do with the basic climatic and natural conditions that can be addressed, but because of the other problems, are not managed to be addressed. Yeah.
More points? Yes, I see. John.
Thank you for a very interesting speech. It's a bit difficult to ask questions in the sense that you have brought up so many different aspects. So, where to start? I was happy to hear in the start that you gave such a positive view, because you know that much better than I do, of the Comprehensive African Development Program and the way the Paris Agenda and so on is used there. Still, I feel when I listen to the continuation of your speech a little bit of contradiction. There is too much money, there is corruption, there is the basic. I think CADEP was presented about a little less than 10 years ago, and it then had signs of being a shopping list, but there were also policy changes of importance proposed then. How would you say that it has developed? What is the most strongest reason for giving such a positive picture of SADC? In a way you explained it, but still you brought up so many things, so I'm not sure really what is the focus in that positive judgment. That is one question. The other question is that you brought up the importance of prices, of markets. And in my view, there is a problem with agriculture. Markets and prices are very important. And in the short run, I'm talking about 5 years or something, a peasant, he is adapting to the market situation. But comparing agriculture to, for example, industry or other kind of market-based production, there is a longer time perspective needed in agriculture. It takes longer time to make changes, and that relates to the issue of resilience that was mentioned. And you didn't mention, if I didn't listen good enough, perhaps, I don't know, but you didn't mention the role of research related to development of new crops, for example, when climate is changing up in the highlands of Ethiopia, the role of gene banks, the role of research for developing new crops. To improve agriculture, there is a need for a big number of factors to improve it. But still, new crops is a lot of research showing that that's what peasants adapt at first, fastest. Even they need the right conditions to use it. But with climate change and with new conditions, there will be a need of both gene banks and the old experience at the local level and advanced research for new crops and new methods for poor peasants. And what about that? Is the money really available for that? I'm not so sure that the money maybe there is too much money available at certain levels and too little at other levels. So is it also a question of the European Union or Sweden to rethink the way it's using its money? Well, long exposition, but that's my question.
Okay, can we take one more question?
Yes, of course, you showed that the EU has a lot of money. But I mean, it's not the only big player on the block. We have China, Of course. So is what, in your opinion, is what China is doing or planning to do in relation to these policies? Are they coherent with them? And is what China is doing with the African countries contributing positively or negatively to these objectives?
Someone more? Oh, yeah, one more. Come back with resilience.
Yeah, no, but I was just wondering about in the beginning you mentioned agriculture growth, and how do you define that? What kind of growth are we talking about? Is it for more people working within the sector? Is it the productivity? Is it the land area? Or can you just mention a little bit more about that objective?
Okay. Francesco?
Yeah. No, I mean, the last one is the way the African Union defines agricultural growth is simply agricultural GDP, so the share of overall goods and services produced and sold in a particular country. So that is can discuss total, yes. No, it's total agricultural growth in a particular countries over the previous year. So the percentage change from one year to the other, which per se is debatable whether that's enough to judge the rural development by overall aggregate statistics, and probably not, but at some point you have also to simplify, otherwise it's impossible to track anything. Maybe I'll address first the question of China, because the other is a bit more, in fact, difficult, and I recognize your points. China, maybe again difficult to just give the net overall contribution of China. I'm afraid it's going to be negative, and has been a bit negative. But that's a bit of an intuition. Of course, I don't have numbers to show. On the positive side, there is no doubt that China has found a more business-oriented model, and also a bit more honest compared to us Europeans, who keep saying that we want to help Africa and then we don't help Africa, and we do a lot of other things, including our own interests, but keep insisting that all of our interventions in Africa are for solidarity, etc. Whereas China has a very clear business model, and we are there to get the resources of Africa, and in exchange we give you better infrastructure. That's basically what it is happening, which means that it is true that Africa is benefiting from Chinese intervention in large-scale infrastructure, dams, roads, trains, airports, and all of that are actually built or maintained. Maintained in the future we will see, unfortunately probably not, because it's being built a bit too fast, but certainly the condition which China can operate without all of our impact assessment and competitive rules and all of that is actually making China doing the infrastructure improvements that are needed in Africa, including to strengthen food security, including to better connect different African markets, happen faster, simply, and cheaper, because I always hear this comment that a Chinese engineer costs 1/5 of a German engineer, so simply they build things faster, and this has had some positive impact in certain parts of Africa. On the other hand, the actual extraction model that China is pursuing is negative, because it's perpetuating, if not even worsening, what we as Europeans unfortunately have imposed through colonialism to Africa, which is extracting resources that are then transformed or consumed abroad. And this has actually worsened since China intervention, which made these companies I mentioned before, the big monocropping producer, very, very successful. And apart from mining, that remains the major driver of economic growth in the last 10 years in many African countries, actually there has been a boom of certain imports from China of African goods. So China has actually even now abandoned since last year food sovereignty themselves, apart from, with the exception of grains, have abandoned self-sovereignty policy, and this means that China needs to go out looking for a lot of other crops and food products outside, and is doing that also through China. So in aggregate numbers, this has led the GDP of African countries grow because they are selling more raw material, including food and unprocessed agricultural goods to China, which is good, maybe for, in certain cases, employment generation and aggregate GDP growth. But in terms of the objective, which is also stated in the CAADP, etc., to make agriculture in Africa more oriented to processing the foods, going up the value chain so that you can get a better money out of that particular product instead of exporting it raw. This is worsening with China. The other problem is that China's trade policy vis-à-vis African agriculture is actually worse than the European Union, because the European Union, with all the bad things we have done and we do, at least the European Union is offering zero duty nearly on any product or any level of value addition coming from Africa, including in agriculture, with few exceptions that have been phased out in terms of restricting trade. Whereas China has exactly a structure of tariffs that follow this logic. If you want to import from Africa into China raw materials, it comes at 0, 5, 8, 10%. The more you go up the value addition of a particular product, the higher the tariffs that China imposes. So it is also giving a disincentive for African companies to move up the value chain, because they simply will have to pay higher tariffs. So I'm afraid that it tends to be a bit negative, but maybe someone could actually say that infrastructure improvement is as important, is actually much more positive. Why CAADP is, why I've given such a positive picture of CAADP? Maybe it's my own bias, because I have worked before and I have seen all of these policy frameworks being imposed and being decided, whereas I've seen in a lot of African countries is really, maybe again, for perpetuating power structure, because Kagame wants to remain in power in Rwanda, etc., but actually agricultural sector in Rwanda is booming. People are finding new job opportunities. There is a thriving business in many parts of the agricultural sector, because they have the opportunity to sell more, to export into the other countries. So the fact that when done properly, the process of deciding not only as a government, but to decide with your own farmers and your own companies what needs to change in African agriculture, when there is a proper governance system, where you can say that Kagame is not a proper governance system, but yeah, I mean, where there is at least someone who understands where the economy needs to go in aggregate terms, because Rwanda has been growing 10-15% per year in the last 10 years, and this has created better roads, better jobs. When there is a good way of running agricultural policy making, where governance tend to be good in economic policy making, CAADP has worked. When governance is bad, CAADP doesn't work. So it really depends. On the local conditions. At least, which is my judgment across the board, is that it has opened up the discussion. So even where governance is not bad, now farmers' organization, traders have a tool and have some principles to refer to say that things need to change. They have been given at least the opportunity to say something about agricultural policy, whereas 15, 20 years ago this wasn't the case. They weren't even being asked what they wanted to do and with their own land, etc., etc. So at least across the board, it is the transparency and inclusiveness that has improved. And this is a spirit of the CAADP that is also managing to do a bit of peer pressure. So because you have good examples like Rwanda or Ghana, etc., then you can also, as an African Union, for example, you can show the results and you can go and say, look, Sierra Leone or Angola, etc., they have spent more money into agriculture. Why have you not done it, you Mozambique or whatever? So at least this element of opening up the conversation and comparing the performance of governance in doing policy making, this is very good. The reality, whether this is making an impact on people's lives, is very context specific, and I'm afraid it goes again back to the governance condition. The issue of research, you're probably very right. This opens a new, another additional topic that I tried not to cover, because it is true. Probably the difference between agriculture and other economic sectors is that maybe agriculture is even more political or more fundamental than other economic sectors. So it is so difficult to distinguish between what happens in agriculture with what happens to politics in general, because land is ultimately where people live and where people feed, and managing the rural areas has been a crucial objective of all of the governments. What we eat is also very important and very different, because it has cultural origin, etc., etc. So it is very difficult to distinguish between agricultural policy making and the key ethnic or political situation in a particular country. And you are right, probably in the long term it would be more important to use agricultural research and technological innovation to make African farmers more able to gain more money and do what they really want with their own land, etc., etc. So there is a whole other series of processes and also international support to agricultural research. But again, that is very political. Agricultural research is very political, and the way also international community and European countries, they do support Africa in doing agricultural research, is very politically oriented and is, roughly speaking, is geared towards our own needs. So that's another area where maybe Europe is doing very bad, because the suggestions that come through indirectly in the CGIAR, this big international system to do agricultural research, etc., is very influenced from what our own countries want to do. So the Dutch will always promote seeds, the French will always promote the interest of the big fruit companies, etc., etc., and then they do research that tries to perpetuate that. Agricultural research, however, to have an impact, takes even longer than individual resilience interventions or technological transfer, etc., etc. And the fact, if you probably is healthier to take the road of supporting more independent endogenous improvement in agricultural research, but it's such a long-term perspective that even matches less than more direct trade or productivity support, and the fact that politicians decide on a 1 or 2 years basis and agricultural research takes 10 years to have an impact makes the two even more disconnected. So that's a problem. But I also hear big debates about the fact that there is a recognition that agricultural researchers, including the international researchers, are not helping the farmer, because it takes too long from a big innovation or a good idea to be useful for the individual farmer in Africa. And some of the donors, for example, who fund this international research, are starting to say, including for the CGIAR, we are not going to give you more money if you don't become more relevant to the farmer faster. So that is another whole series of interesting discussion taking place, yes, on agricultural research.
Okay, I'm not going to prolong this, but I think that there is one issue, and it's not a question really, I want to make comment. I mean, the theme of this series of discussions we have had has been on conflict prevention and security, and we have looked at the issue in general, but we are trying also to see what different sectors, how they will interplay with the and how they will sort of be part of the conflictual situation which we see in front of us all around the world. And one of the areas is, of course, food security. And you have now given a very broad analysis of food security, and there are so many issues to be raised, and Jan started with a few, and we could add more issues. I mean, perhaps I should ask you to just end by commenting on the question is, and I think we have seen that climate has been part of the major conflicts, which are now leading to refugee situations all around the world, but also the food situation. And you also already mentioned the riots that comes with increased prices and so on. I mean, could you just a few words on the interconnection between, if we are not successful in Africa to raise agriculture production and make countries more resilient or secure when it comes to food, what risks can we see? How will this interplay with all the others risks when it comes to for conflicts, and how can we and how will it interplay with conflict resolution that we are working on?
Well, if the answer is risks to be too simple, but if we don't get improvements in the way individual governments and citizens can make their own decisions, food security conditions will not improve, and demographic trends are very clear. Africa is a booming continent. The majority of the people are young. Population growth is going to be large, and even more so in the future. And we're going to have more problems of conflict because the resources are very limited. There will be increased competition on the few resources available. There will not be food for everyone. There will be tension on who can access food, etc., etc. So more tension, more instability, more. Ultimately, to me, the solution is governance and better democratic processes, but with less access to food and more climate-related problems in managing natural resources, this can only increase. And so either people will have to, like they're doing unfortunately now, from part of the Horn of Africa or the Middle East, go somewhere else and try to come to Europe. I don't see many other. The trend is that one. If governance doesn't improve in the way Africans can make their own decisions and produce their own food and have a more stable society, and I only see conflict increase, migration increase, and unfortunately it's a bleak picture. But I'm an optimist, and I'm hoping that climate-related tensions and the risks for our own societies will end up forcing also the international community to improve the way they organize, and there is going to be a lot of resources, for example, available under the climate change funds and resources, and I'm hoping that the Africans will do their own improvements to clarify what they need in terms of managing natural resources and food security, and they will use the really large available resources better, and the Europeans and the Americans and the Chinese will be better at also more transparent and providing these resources, and the combination of these two improvements hopefully will make agricultural productivity better, prices go down instead of going up, and that's the only solution to me in the long term. Otherwise, migration will continue, war will increase. And I'm sorry about that.
With these positive words, thank you very much. And thank you for coming today. And we'll have the next meeting in this theme will be in
20th of January.
20?
January 20.
And that will be on the refugee situation. We try to go very deep into the sort of the nitties and gritties of what has led to the present refugee situation in the world. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Francesco.